My name is Renata Cole. I'm 39 years old, and at 2:17 in the morning, my younger sister stood in my hallway holding my car keys, asking me to tell the police I'd been driving. The headlight was shattered. A long scrape ran down the bumper like something had been dragged across it. And there, right along the hood, a thin red smear that didn't belong on a car. "He came out of nowhere," she said. Her voice was shaking, but her eyes weren't. "I barely touched him." Then, quieter, I kept driving. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I did. A man was somewhere on a cold street, possibly alone, possibly dying, and the first conversation happening about it wasn't, "Did anyone call for help?" It was, "Who's going to say they were behind the wheel?" If that sounds rare to you, it isn't. Right now, in this country, a driver flees the scene in roughly 1 out of every 7 reported crashes, the highest rate ever recorded. Most of the time, it's not a stranger. It's someone's daughter, someone's son, someone somebody loves enough to lie for. That night, it was my sister. And apparently, it was supposed to be me too. Before I could even ask a real question, my mother pushed past me into the apartment, grabbed my shoulders like she was steadying a table that might tip over, and said, "Just tell them you were driving." My father came in right behind her, calm in the way he always was when he wanted something terrible to sound reasonable. "Your sister has a campaign," he said. "You don't have anything to lose." That was the sentence that stuck to me. You don't have anything to lose. They believed that. Genuinely. To them, I was the daughter who quietly disappeared into some government job nobody asked about twice. The one who didn't return calls fast enough, who missed the big dinners, who never explained herself because every time I tried, the conversation found its way back to my sister within 30 seconds. They had no idea that 3 weeks earlier, inside a federal courthouse, I had raised my right hand and sworn an oath. Not a metaphor. An actual oath to apply the law without fear, without favor, and, this is the part that would matter most before sunrise, without family influence. My sister looked around my small apartment, at my old sweatshirt hanging on the door, at the second-hand furniture I'd never gotten around to replacing. And she smiled, not a cruel smile, just a tired, certain one. "Who would believe you anyway?" She meant it kindly, almost. Like she was letting me in on a fact we both already knew. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my car had a security system installed after a threat connected to a case I'd worked. It didn't just record a crash. It recorded impact, audio, GPS, everything, and it had already started uploading to a server no one in that room could touch. The lie they wanted me to carry that night was about to meet something none of them had accounted for. But before I tell you what happened next, what my parents tried, what my sister said when she realized what that car had caught, I want to ask you something. If your family came to your door at 2 a.m. and asked you to take the blame for someone you loved, what would you say? Type your answer below. I want to know how many of you would say yes before you even finished reading this sentence. To understand why my parents did what they did that night, you have to understand what our family actually was, underneath the holiday photos and the group texts. It wasn't really a family of 4. It was a family with 1 investment and 3 shareholders. My sister's name was Vivian. At 32, she was running for a seat on the city council, and her whole campaign was built on words like accountability and integrity and safer streets. Her face was on bus benches, on yard signs up and down 3 neighborhoods. On a campaign van she'd refused to drive that night because, in her words, it's covered in logos, someone would recognize it. Funny detail to remember, in hindsight. She had the presence of mind to think about optics before she thought about the man lying in the road. My mother chaired 2 community boards and introduced Vivian at every function as the future. My father had spent 25 years advising political campaigns, and he genuinely believed there was no crisis that couldn't be managed if you controlled the story fast enough. That belief was about to be tested in a way his career never had. In their version of our family, Vivian was the future. I was the cautionary tale. They told people at church I'd dropped out of law school after some falling out with my father. What actually happened was I transferred programs, graduated, clerked for a federal judge, spent 6 years as a prosecutor, and built an entire career they simply never asked about. Every time I brought up my work, my father would find a way to steer it back to Vivian within a sentence or two. Eventually, I stopped bringing it up at all. Not out of resentment, just exhaustion. You can only repeat yourself to a wall so many times before you stop talking to the wall. Here's something that isn't just my story, though. Researchers at Brigham Young University pulled together data from nearly 20,000 people across 30 separate studies and confirmed what a lot of us already suspected sitting at our own dinner tables. Parental favoritism isn't folklore. It's measurable. And the sibling who isn't the favorite doesn't just feel a little left out. The research shows it reshapes the entire relationship, breeding a quiet, long-term resentment that doesn't need a single dramatic moment to take root. It just needs years of small ones. I didn't need a study to tell me that. I'd lived it. But it helped later to understand that what happened in my family wasn't some unique cruelty. It was a pattern playing out almost exactly the way researchers predicted it would. Vivian had borrowed my car that night, claiming a photographer had been following her after a donor event, and she needed something unmarked to get home in. I said yes. I always said yes when she used that voice, the please, I need my sister voice. Some old part of me still answered it, even after everything. At 11:40, she texted that she'd bring the car back in the morning. At 2:17, she was standing in my hallway instead, smelling like wine and peppermint, asking me to become someone else's alibi. Tell me exactly what happened, I said. I already did. No. You gave me the version you want repeated. Something shifted in her face right then. The frightened look I'd let myself believe in for the first 30 seconds disappeared, replaced by something practiced, the same composed expression she used in hostile interviews on the campaign trail. That was the moment I understood this wasn't really about fear. It was about management. And I was about to become the thing being managed. My parents were about to ask the one person in that room they'd spent years underestimating to make the biggest decision of the night. They had no idea what was hanging in a frame behind my office door, 3 rooms away. By 2:40, my father had stopped asking questions and started giving orders. That was always how you knew things had gotten serious in our house, not when his voice got louder, but when it got quieter and more organized. He told my mother to call Vivian's campaign manager and say she'd come down with food poisoning after the donor event. He told Vivian to go through her phone and delete anything that mentioned my car. Then he turned to me and asked for mine. Why? I said. We need to know what's already out there. You mean you want to see what needs to disappear? His jaw tightened at that. Don't use courtroom language with me. Which was almost funny if you think about it. For years he'd waved off my career like it was paperwork nobody important read. Now, suddenly, my choice of words had teeth, and he didn't like being on the receiving end of them. My mother sat on the edge of the couch, twisting the strap of her bag. Say you were tired, she told me. Say you thought you hit a trash can and just kept going. That sounds believable. Believable to who? To normal people, Vivian said, not even looking up from her phone. That word, normal, landed strange. As if the 4 of us sitting in my living room at 3 in the morning, rehearsing a story to explain away a man bleeding somewhere on Fax Road, were the normal ones, and I was the one being unreasonable for not immediately joining the script. My father grabbed an envelope off my counter and started writing out a timeline in his neat, controlled handwriting. Renata left the reception at 1:15. The accident happened near 1:40. She panicked, drove home, called Vivian. You told me 5 minutes ago that Vivian came here after hearing about the accident, I said. Now she's the one who gets the call? He stopped writing. My mother looked between the two of us. Which version is easier to explain, she asked. And that's the sentence I want you to actually hear, because it tells you everything about what was happening in that room. She wasn't asking whether either version was true. She was asking which lie performed better. They weren't deciding whether to cover something up anymore. They'd already decided that. They were just editing the cover-up for clarity. Then Vivian made a mistake. She was scrolling, half to herself, and said, Evan said the street was completely empty. The room went still. Who's Evan? I asked. No one, she said, too fast. You told me you were alone in the car. I misspoke. My father cut in immediately. That's not relevant right now, but it was a little late for that. For people in a room, quietly stitching together a fake timeline, had just discovered that one of them was already lying to the other three. If you can't keep your own story straight in front of the people helping you build it, that's not a small crack. That's the whole foundation giving way. I want to pause here on something, because it matters more than it might seem. Colorado's State Patrol put out a statement recently that stuck with me. The head of their traffic division said there's really only one right decision in a crash, and it's staying. Not because leaving guarantees you'll get caught, though the data says you probably will eventually. It's because everything that happens after you leave the scene becomes its own separate set of consequences, stacked on top of whatever the crash itself was. Fleeing doesn't shrink your problem. It multiplies it. Nobody in my living room understood that yet. They still believed the danger was the crash. They had no idea the greater danger was every decision they were making in the 2 hours after it. My father's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and for just a second, something in his face changed color. "The victim's alive," he said. Relief flickered across Vivian's expression, and then, almost instantly, something else replaced it. Something that looked less like relief for a man she'd struck, and more like relief for a headline she wouldn't have to read. I looked at her for a long moment. "A man survived," I said quietly. "And that's what you're relieved about? That the consequences might be smaller?" She didn't answer me. Nobody did. But somewhere in the next hour, someone was about to walk through my front door who none of them expected, and he was going to make it a lot harder for anyone in that room to keep their story straight. At 4:28, someone knocked on my door. Not the tentative knock of a neighbor woken up by voices, a fast, nervous double knock. Vivian went pale before she even looked through the peephole. "That's Evan," she said. "The Evan who was apparently in the car with you? The one you told me didn't exist." She didn't answer. She just opened the door. He was maybe 30, dressed like he'd left a fundraiser in a hurry, tie loosened, jacket half on. There was a red mark across his forehead, and his hands were shaking badly enough that I noticed it before he'd even said a word. "What is he doing here?" I asked. "He's helping us manage the situation," Vivian said. Evan glanced at the car keys still sitting on my counter. "We need to contain this," he said, and then, almost to himself, "You were in the car with me. You told them the street was empty." I said, "That proves nothing," Vivian snapped. My father stepped in like he was trying to physically hold the conversation together. "We're not conducting interviews here." "No," I said. "You're coordinating testimony. Those are very different things, and one of them is a crime." Evan looked at me properly for the first time. "What exactly do you do?" he asked. Vivian answered before I could. "She writes reports." "I wrote reports," I said. "I also stood in front of grand juries. I cross-examined witnesses who'd rehearsed their stories a lot better than the four of you have tonight. I know exactly what this room sounds like from the outside, because I used to be the person listening to rooms like this from the outside." Nobody said anything for a second. Here's a detail worth knowing, because it explains a lot about why nights like this happen the way they do. Federal data on fatal hit-and-run crashes shows something surprisingly consistent. Nearly 3 out of 5 drivers who flee the scene weren't even driving their own vehicle. It's almost never a stranger's car. It's a sibling's, a partner's, a friend's. Someone who trusted them enough to hand over the keys without asking too many questions. Vivian wasn't an outlier that night. She was, statistically, exactly the profile, right down to borrowing the exact kind of car she did. My mother finally spoke, quieter than before. "Why are you saying all this now?" "Because you're asking me to commit crimes on your behalf," I said, while assuming I'm too small a person to notice I'm doing it. My father waved a hand like he was swatting the sentence out of the air. "No one is asking you to commit a felony. False reporting. Obstruction. Coordinated statements to police. Those aren't registration paperwork, Dad. Those have names, and I've prosecuted people for less than what's happened in this room tonight." Vivian's composure finally slipped. "You think you can lecture me? After what you did for me 8 years ago?" I knew exactly what she meant, and for a second the room went somewhere else entirely, back to a night I'd let myself forget because remembering it made me complicit in my own erasure. She'd used my name once before on a lease, after damaging an apartment at a party. I'd covered it. Paid for it. Told myself I was protecting her. What I'd actually done was teach her that my name was available whenever hers became inconvenient. That was property damage, I said. No one was hurt. You still lied. Yes. And it was wrong then too. I just didn't understand yet that fixing it once doesn't make you the permanent solution. My father seized on that immediately, so even your morality has limits, like he'd caught me in something. He hadn't. He just found the one thread in the room he thought he could still pull. But Evan wasn't looking at either of them anymore. He was looking at me, and at the hallway behind me, toward the small office at the end of it. The one with the door I hadn't opened yet that night. He didn't know it, but he was about to be the first person in that apartment to find out exactly who he'd been asked to help cover for. My father followed me down the hallway, still talking, still trying to sound like a man in control of a situation that had already left his hands an hour ago. "You are not calling anyone," he said. I didn't answer him. I opened the office door. Behind it hung my robe, black, plain, still holding the faint crease from being folded in its garment bag. Beneath it, framed against the wall, was my commission, sealed by the United States District Court. Next to that, a photograph of me taking my oath beside the chief judge, my hand raised, my face doing that thing faces do when a moment is bigger than you expected it to feel. On the desk sat a small brass plaque. It read, "The Honorable Renata A. Cole, United States Magistrate Judge." My father stopped mid-sentence. Vivian, who'd followed us down the hall out of some mix of panic and curiosity, stood in the doorway and just stared. "What is that?" she asked, like the words themselves didn't make sense in that order. "My commission. You're a judge. A federal magistrate judge. Sworn in 3 weeks ago." My mother's hand went to her mouth. "You never told us." "I told you about the confirmation hearing. You said you were busy prepping Vivian for a debate. I mentioned the investiture ceremony. You sent me back photos of her campaign signs going up. Nobody in that hallway had an answer for that, because there wasn't one. It wasn't a secret I'd kept. It was an announcement I'd made, more than once, into a silence that had simply swallowed it every time." My father recovered fastest. He always did. "Then you understand discretion," he said. "Judges handle sensitive situations quietly all the time. Use that." "My position doesn't give me the authority to erase a crime, Dad. It gives me the obligation not to. It gives you credibility. Use it to protect this family. You want a sitting federal judge to help file a false police report. I want my daughter to protect her sister. Those aren't the same request, and you know it." Vivian's expression was doing something complicated, shock sliding into a kind of frantic recalculation, like she was mentally rewriting every conversation of the last 2 hours now that she understood who'd actually been in the room with her. "If this gets out," she said slowly, "it doesn't just hurt me. It could hurt you too. A federal judge connected to a hidden hit and run, that's a headline on its own." "That's true," I said. "Then help me." "I want influence without accountability," I said. "That's what you're actually asking for. And I can't give you that, even if I wanted to. Especially because I have this." I opened the security app on my phone and turned the screen toward the hallway. A map traced the SUV's route from the reception, the exact time of impact, a speed reading, and a small green confirmation icon. Preservation lock initiated. "The vehicle recorded everything," I said. "Exterior video. Interior audio. GPS braking data. Images from both front seats." It uploaded automatically the moment the impact sensor triggered, to a server none of us in this hallway can access or delete. Vivian's face went white. Somewhere behind her I heard Evan, still standing near the kitchen, say quietly, "Interior audio?" My father's voice dropped to something almost hollow. "You knew this the whole time?" "I knew the system existed. I didn't know what it caught until right now, same as you." "You let us talk," he said, like that was the crime. "I didn't force anyone in this apartment to invent a fake timeline. I didn't ask anyone to delete messages, or pressure me into lying, or discuss framing me for something I didn't do. You did that entirely on your own, in front of a phone that was already recording the conversation you had in the car, and now this one too." The silence that followed wasn't like the earlier silences. Those had been tense, calculating, full of people still trying to figure out their next move. This one was different. This was the silence of 4 people finally understanding there wasn't a next move left to make. Vivian's voice, when it finally came, was smaller than I'd heard it in years. What happens now? I didn't answer right away. Because the truth was, the hardest part of that night wasn't the footage, or the confrontation, or even my father's face when he realized what he'd admitted to on a recorded line. The hardest part was that I already knew what was coming for the man they hadn't asked about once, and I was about to find out just how far my family would go to make sure that never became their problem. By 8 that morning, we finally had a name for the man Vivian had struck. Samuel Reyes, 61, a maintenance supervisor walking home after his bus route got canceled from icy roads. Fractured leg. Broken ribs. A head injury doctors couldn't yet say much about, other than that he was expected to survive, and that expected was doing a lot of work in that sentence. I want to sit on that fact for a second, because it's easy to lose a real person inside a story like this. Pedestrians and cyclists make up a disproportionate share of hit-and-run injuries in this country. Roughly 1 in 4 pedestrian deaths in a crash involves a driver who fled. Samuel wasn't a statistic to me by that point. He was a man lying in a hospital bed while, 3 miles away, my family debated polling numbers. That gap between what was actually happening to him and what my family was actually discussing was the moment something in me finished closing. Vivian's attorney arrived a few hours later. Her name was Danielle Ford, and the first thing she did after hearing a rough outline of the night was tell everyone in the room to stop talking immediately. She ordered Vivian and Evan to preserve their phones, not wipe them, and she warned my parents, carefully, professionally, that the conversation they'd already had in my apartment could itself become evidence if investigators found out coordination had taken place. My father bristled. That was a private family conversation. Private conversations become evidence, Danielle said, the moment they concern concealing a crime. Investigators reviewed the footage from my car that same afternoon. I wasn't in the room for it, and I didn't ask to be. What came back, through Danielle relaying it to the family a few hours later, was worse than anything Vivian had admitted to that night. Interior audio caught her drinking from a small flask while driving. Evan's voice, more than once, telling her to slow down. She was reading a text on her phone, a campaign update of all things, in the exact seconds before the SUV struck Samuel inside a marked crosswalk. Evan yelled for her to stop, to call an ambulance. Instead, she drove half a block, pulled over just long enough to look back through the rear window, and said, on tape, "If I stay, the campaign is finished." Then she drove into a parking garage to look at the damage. Evan suggested calling it in anonymously. She refused and called my father through the car's hand-free system instead. That call was recorded too. On it, my father told her not to use her personal phone and to drive straight to my apartment because the SUV was registered in my name. Renata doesn't have much of a public life, he said. We can contain this around her. Contain. That was the word he used. Not explain. Not protect. Contain, like I was a spill, not a daughter. When Danielle read that part aloud, nobody in the room could look at me. Not because they were ashamed. Exactly, I think shame requires you to fully register what you did. It was closer to the specific silence of people watching a plan collapse and realizing, for the first time, that the plan had never actually been sound. It had just been confident. Detectives came back a short while later with warrants for several devices. My father argued that the call in question was private family communication, protected by some line he seemed to believe still existed. It didn't. Detective Alvarez told him so, plainly, and officers left with his phone, my mother's tablet, Vivian's campaign laptop, and Evan's work phone. Evan had already handed over his personal device an hour earlier and started cooperating on his own. When Vivian found out, she called him a traitor. He told you to stop the whole time, I said. He's not betraying you. He's doing exactly what all of you expected me to do for you tonight, protect himself, without asking permission first. She didn't have an answer for that either. By that point, there weren't many left. Vivian suspended her campaign the next morning. By the following week, she was formally charged, leaving the scene of an accident involving serious injury, reckless driving, and making false statements to police. Evan entered a cooperation agreement. He'd been drinking too, though never driving, and investigators confirmed he'd urged her to stop and call for help. He lost his job on the campaign, but he didn't lose much else, mostly because he'd stopped digging the hole the moment he realized how deep it already was. My father was investigated for obstruction and for the coordinated statements he'd made on that recorded call. He wasn't the one who hit Samuel, but contain this around her turned out to carry weight of its own once a prosecutor heard the audio. His professional reputation didn't recover from it. Colleagues who'd worked with him for decades quietly stopped calling. My mother wasn't criminally charged, but she resigned from both community boards after local coverage connected her name to the story. It's a strange kind of consequence, not a courtroom, just a slow erosion of the rooms you used to walk into without anyone whispering. I stayed a witness through most of it, which meant staying largely silent in public, which was its own kind of strange. The courthouse temporarily reassigned my caseload, while an ethics review confirmed I hadn't done anything improper. I hadn't asked for the footage, hadn't influenced the investigation, hadn't used my position for anything except refusing to abuse it. The review cleared me. It didn't undo the 3 weeks of being a headline instead of a judge. Samuel Reyes woke up a few days after the accident. He spent weeks in rehabilitation. I wrote him a private letter through his attorney, not asking for forgiveness, because that wasn't mine to ask for, just telling him I was sorry my vehicle had been part of what happened to him, and that I'd respect whatever privacy his family wanted. I never heard back, and I didn't expect to. That letter was never about getting something from him. It was about saying the one true thing nobody in my family had said that entire first night, that a person had been hurt, and that mattered more than any of us. Colorado's State Patrol put out a message around that time that I keep coming back to, that fear is almost always the reason people flee a crash, but fear was never going to be an adequate defense, because staying is the only decision that doesn't multiply the damage afterward. Vivian understood that only in hindsight. By the time she did, the choice had already been made for her, permanently, on a recording she couldn't argue with. 3 months later, she wrote me a letter. It was long, and some of it was honest in a way I hadn't expected. She wrote about the pressure of the campaign, about our father's control, about how she'd learned early that attention was the only currency that mattered in our house. Then she wrote the part that actually landed, that when she'd said, "Who would believe you anyway?" she'd wanted me to feel small on purpose. That some part of her had been angry, not scared, when she found out what I actually did for a living, angry that I'd built something outside her reach without her noticing. I read it twice and put it in a drawer. I didn't respond right away, and when I did, it wasn't with forgiveness. Forgiveness offered too quickly becomes another kind of cover, a way of letting someone skip the part where they actually sit with what they did. I wrote back one line. I'll consider contact once each of you can take responsibility without blaming fear, or the campaign, or me. Until then, please don't come to my home or my courthouse. My father called it cold. My mother called it cruel. I called it the first boundary I'd ever actually kept. I sold the SUV a few months after the investigation closed. Some objects hold on to a night long after the actual repairs are finished, and I didn't want to keep driving something that still remembered more about that road than I wanted to. I also did something smaller, but it mattered more to me than I expected. I moved my judicial commission out of the office and hung it in the entryway of my new place, right where anyone walking in would see it first. Not because I needed a stranger's approval. Because I'd spent years making myself smaller to keep other people comfortable, and I was done doing that quietly. Here's what I keep coming back to months later. That night, my family believed I had nothing to lose. That's the sentence that started the whole thing. You don't have anything to lose, and it was wrong on every level, but it was wrong in a specific way worth naming. Even if I hadn't had a career, or a title, or a framed commission on the wall, they still wouldn't have had the right to spend what was left. A conscience isn't something you're required to hand over just because your family assumes you're the one with nothing else to protect. For most of my life, I confused endurance with loyalty. I thought being the reliable one meant absorbing whatever needed absorbing, a bad night, a bad debt, a bad decision that needed a name attached to it that wasn't Vivian's. Every time I did that, I told myself I was holding the family together. What I was actually doing was teaching everyone in it that my boundaries were negotiable and hers weren't. That's not protection. Real protection looks out for the people in danger of getting hurt, not the people in danger of getting caught. My family had those two things reversed for years, and it took a night like that one for me to see how completely. There's research that backs up something I lived long before I ever read the studies, that favoritism isn't some rare family dysfunction, it's disturbingly common, and it doesn't just bruise the sibling on the losing end of it in childhood. It reshapes how that person shows up in every relationship afterward, including the one with themselves. I spent years believing my accomplishments didn't count for much, because the people who should have noticed them had trained me not to expect it. It took a stranger's flask of wine, a fractured leg belonging to a man I'd never met, and one very inconvenient piece of dashboard footage to finally break that pattern for good. I didn't destroy my sister that night. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy to tell this story like some kind of victory lap, and it was never that. Vivian did what she did. The footage simply refused to disagree with reality on her behalf. All I did was stop being the thing standing between her choices and their consequences. That's the part I'd ask you to sit with if any of this sounded familiar. Loyalty that requires you to disappear isn't loyalty. It's a role someone assigned you, usually a long time before you were old enough to say no to it. And the hardest, most responsible form of love isn't always covering for the people you love when they fail. Sometimes it's stepping back and letting the truth reach them without you standing in its way. So I'll ask you what I've been asked more than once since that night, and what I still don't have a clean answer for myself. If it had been you in that hallway at 2:17 in the morning, if it had been your sister, your brother, your own name on that car's registration, would you have protected them? Protected yourself? Or protected the truth? Tell me honestly in the comments. I read every one. This story is a dramatized account shared for reflection, not a factual case file, but the pattern underneath it is real for a lot of people. If any part of tonight's video felt familiar, it might be worth listening a little more closely to the parts of your own story you've learned to talk yourself out of.